Wanted to record a brief supplemental video just to touch on the concept of economic systems because this is a really important concept in economics and one that we probably shouldn't just cover in a hey, look at this online and read your book look. So a couple of the videos I gave you do a really good job of looking at the difference between command and market economies, but really don't touch the other economic systems. So briefly wanted to look at there are four types of economic systems. There's really three, and then a mixed economy is usually a mixture of two of the three kinds, which is often a mixture of command and market. The traditional economy is an old school tribal economy, or one that operates based on custom. The market economy is one based on free enterprise and exchange and private property. The command economy is one that is based on government ownership of goods and services. So the traditional economy, basically in an economic system, what we're doing is we're answering the questions: what to produce, how to produce it, and for whom should we produce it. And so an economic system is essentially trying to determine what are the answers to those three questions, as well as how do we allocate land, labor, and capital. In a traditional economy, things are done because of the way we've always done them. There's no real sense of an economic order. There really is no sense of money in a traditional economy, or property or possessions. Things are just done because they have always been done that way. And as a result, it's kind of hard to ascribe any kind of economic order to them. It's just economic order kind of exists. And that's one thing we'll learn, is that economic orders generally, in all orders in society, generally exist spontaneously, or they emerge spontaneously. We refer to that as emergent or spontaneous order. And so in a traditional economy, things are done just because this is the way we have always done them. And so we tend to see these in very primitive societies, or societies that don't have money, or they don't have any real sense of property. And so those concepts do exist, but they exist in very small numbers or in very abstract ways, rather than in more formal ways like we would expect them, where we have defined property rights, we have an accepted sense of money. Exchange happens, but it happens because of tradition or custom. For example, if you remember learning about the Plains Indians in your junior year U.S. history class, one thing they were known for was that they generally did not believe that property could be owned. So they generally lived communally in a small area among their tribe, and they had very defined rules for how things were allocated. So, for example, if they went out on a hunt and there were certain people, for example, the men would go hunt and the women would have specific roles as well within the camp. And when they went and hunted, there were specific rules as to how the kill would be distributed. So, for example, the person who killed an animal would get the best choice cuts of the meat, and then maybe the chiefs of the tribe would get the next best choice and cuts of the meat, and then things would be distributed according to a predetermined order. And so a traditional economy, the one thing about it is that everybody kind of knows their role, but it does not lead to a whole lot of growth. Because there's no individual initiative, you really can't break outside of the mold. And because of that, traditional economies tend to not grow, they tend to not change, they tend to not develop. And so because of that, you may not see a lot of change from generation to generation. And while that's often comforting, especially to older people who don't like change, and to younger people who know exactly what their role is, it does kind of create a box that is very difficult to climb out of. And, we've seen that. Economies that don't change don't grow. And you can look at the pre-Civil War South in the U.S. The economy didn't change. It didn't grow. And and it essentially got passed up by the North, which was handling most of the production and dealt with most of the economic growth. And you can't say the pre-Civil War South was, say, a traditional economy, but it was one that did not change. It didn't grow. Things were done according to custom as they always have been done. And, we involved in the same industries. Everybody has the same roles. There's kind of defined specific roles. And so while it wasn't a true traditional economy, it certainly had some elements of it. And so you can look at tribal societies like Native American societies, and see elements of traditional economies. The command economy is probably the most recent of these because it is not one that evolved out of an emergent order. It requires a government or a central authority to own things and make the economic decisions. So the decisions on what to produce, how to produce, or for whom to produce are all made by a central authority, which is almost always going to be government. And, for example, Cuba and North Korea are good examples of command economies. And so everything is owned by the government. And so while it sounds really good, hey, there's a central planner that will distribute all goods and services according to what they need, and everybody provides work according to what they can provide, and everybody is treated equally, and there's no waste and no inefficiency. The reality is there's a lot of waste and inefficiency in command economies, and the reason why is because there's no market prices. And I wish we had more time in this course to really be able to dig into that, because that is probably the most misunderstood part of command economies. We know that one of the big disadvantages of them are that there's no incentive, that humans have no incentive because there's no ability to personally grow. You're not going to personally profit from doing a better job at your workplace, for example. Your workplace isn't going to personally profit from doing a better job because essentially the government owns everything. And so what it does is instead of telling somebody, instead of, say, you work at an auto factory, instead of there being incentive to produce as many cars as you possibly can because you might make profit off of those cars, like in a market economy, instead, the government tells you exactly how many cars you need to produce, and you're going to produce exactly that many cars. You're going to set a quota, and people are going to work as hard as they need to produce that number of cars and no more. You can't produce less because you'll get in trouble, and you're not going to produce more because you don't have to. And there's no incentive to produce more, and there's really no incentive to even produce quality. And that has been a real problem as well. And that's what most people look at when they look at disadvantages of command economies. But really the main problem, and this is something that has been explored most notably by Ludwig von Mises about 70 or 80 years ago, is that there's a calculation problem. The reality is that no central authority, no central planner can have enough perfect information to be able to find out how much of everything we have and the individual needs of every single person in that economy, and be able to plan for what we have and what everybody needs and the exact number of each. And so you end up with a lot of imbalances, and there's no way to reconcile the issue of what we have versus what people need. And the other thing is, those planning decisions then, instead of being determined by consumers, they're influenced by the biases of those planners because they view things based on what they think people need. And quite honestly, we all act in our own self-interest. Economic actors all act in their own self-interest. Every individual acts in his or her own self-interest. And as a result of that, there's no, and that doesn't stop when you go into government. Okay, you don't just suddenly stop becoming somebody who acts in your own self-interest when you go into government service. And those central planners also act in their own self-interest, and because of that, what they're going to do is they're going to take care of themselves first. And so you can look at in North Korea or Cuba or the old Soviet Union, they've got these really well-funded militaries, but they can't even get running water up to certain apartments, or the apartments they build are very blocky and very Spartan and not really great places to live, or they can't produce enough cars or televisions or clothes or other things for their populations. And the consumer has no choice really over what kind of clothes are there. You get whatever clothes the central planners think you will like, and things are done often for the convenience of the planners rather than the desires of the consumers. So the advantages are decision making come from one area. There's a belief the economy will take care of the basic needs and economic security, but the problem is that individual choice is often stifled. There's the calculation problem, where the imperfect information that planners have don't allow them to understand how much of everything everybody needs, and therefore massive shortages usually result, and those tend to have to get reconciled through a black market. And so there's a lack of incentives as well because of the perversity of the institutions in a command economy. So communism is a form of command economy. I do not like how your book sets this up, because it looks at the four types and then dives deeper into communism and capitalism. Communism and socialism are both forms of command economies. In theory, communism does not have a state, so it can't be a command economy because there's no state, there's no central government, that the workers basically seize the factors of production, and then people share the resources voluntarily. Now, in reality, what ends up happening, and what we have seen in the Soviet Union and in Cuba and in North Korea and in the old Eastern Bloc countries and in China, especially pre-1978 before they opened up, it becomes a command economy because there has to be a central authority to oversee the production rather than and kind of tell the workers what they're going to do and how they're going to work and how things are going to be. So therefore, no nation has truly achieved Marx's ideal communist society. Instead, what we see is a form of socialism, which is kind of what becomes the command economy. And that's kind of what communism has become. There is no private property like what Marx believed, but things are owned by the government, what we call public ownership. Whenever you see the word public in economics, that means government. And centralized decision-making. The government makes all the decisions in an economy. The idea is that we, through the lack of ownership of private property, the government owns everything, that all decisions are made in the public interest for the greater good to protect both workers and consumers from the decentralized decision-making of a market economy. And so, we see kind of the real weaknesses of this, are really the same weaknesses of a command economy. And really what it comes down to is who's going to be the privileged class. And that's really, the big battle, if you will, between capitalists and socialists, or who's going to be the privileged class. In socialism, it's the government. It's government officials. In capitalism or market economies, it's business owners and entrepreneurs who are kind of the privileged class. And so why are the government officials the privileged class? Because they make all the decisions. And obviously, they're going to take care of themselves first. And so, socialism's real struggle is that it does not balance production and consumption because there are no market prices. And because of those, there's lots of shortages, and also the consumer's needs are not often met because they're clouded by the biases of the planners, as well as the planners' inability to forecast what each individual family or each individual needs. In a market economy, the interaction of supply and demand answers the questions of what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. And the reality is that what to produce is often determined by consumers, and that they make those decisions on what you buy. They're also made by entrepreneurs who are trying to forecast what consumers want and sell it to them so they can make a profit. Entrepreneurs determine how they're produced, and entrepreneurs are business owners, and for whom is the consumer. It's based on the idea of voluntary exchange, flowing from Adam Smith's ideas in The Wealth of Nations. Now, market economies existed before The Wealth of Nations was written in 1776, but the basic thesis of the wealth of nations is that the division of labor leads to specialization. Through specialization, we have exchange. And people are best when they exchange voluntarily, when they own their own property and exchange voluntarily. And free markets and markets allow for us to carry out those exchanges, because markets are any place where goods and services are exchanged. As a result of that, there is a limited role for government in a market economy. Basically, the government may be able to provide some basic things like national defense or education or infrastructure, but the main role of government in a market economy is to do two things: settle contracts and disputes between people over property and protect private property's rights. That each person is allowed to accumulate and maintain their own property, and they can voluntarily exchange it for other people's property. And so it is individuals who own the land, labor, and capital rather than government in a market economy. And so the basic idea is that markets are controlled by the invisible hand, that producers compete with each other for consumers' dollars, with profit rewarding them, and consumers compete with each other for the goods that producers have, and if those goods are scarce, consumers will bid up the price. If the goods are abundant, producers will bid down the price essentially to get the sale. So competition as a result automatically regulates the economy and produces maximum efficiency. One thing Adam Smith said is that it is not for the benevolence of his own mind that the butcher, the brewer, and the baker produce what they do. The butcher doesn't just cut meat because he loves cutting meat. The baker doesn't just make bread because he loves making bread. They do so because they will profit from that. The butcher knows that he is going to, if he cuts meat, and he's very good at it, he can sell that meat to other people and make a profit, and he benefits from the profit, the excess money he makes. The people he sells to benefit because now they don't have to cut meat to eat. They can go specialize in what they want and buy it from the butcher. The baker, the same thing. It's not necessarily that he loves making bread, but that he acts in his own self-interest, making bread so he can sell his excess bread to others and then obtain what he wants with that money. Whereas now I don't have to make bread. I can buy it from the baker. And so I can do something else, and I can essentially trade the money I make from what I do, which is teaching, to the baker to buy bread with. And so us all acting in our own self-interest and then voluntarily exchanging from our access doesn't just benefit us. The butcher doesn't just benefit from cutting meat and making a profit from it. The baker doesn't just benefit from making bread and making a profit from selling the bread. Society benefits as well, because now our community has a butcher, it has a baker that is selling us meat and bread, and so that we don't have to do those things ourselves, which allows us to specialize as well. And that's how the invisible hand works. It's essentially all of us acting in our own self-interest are guided as if by an invisible hand to not just benefit ourselves, but benefit the community at large. And so the strengths of a market economy are many. Consumers are sovereign. You generally get what you desire as long as it is profitable for firms to offer what you want. And if you're willing to pay enough for it, somebody's going to offer it because it will be profitable to them. And so the consumers are sovereign, and as a result, they're very flexible. They can adjust to market conditions because they're governed by prices. And so go back to the idea where we have resources and we have consumers. In a command economy, nobody has perfect information to be able to get the goods from the producer to the consumer and know exactly how much of anything anybody wants. But a market price will tell you that. If there's a shortage of goods, that'll drive up the price, and that'll tell producers to produce more of this good and consumers to buy less of it, and thus things will be back in balance. If there's a surplus of goods, the price will be very low. That'll tell consumers to buy more of this good, but it'll tell producers to make less of it, and again, the economy will be in balance. And so a high price will tell people make more of it, and thus the consumer demand will be satisfied. And one thing we looked at is during the coronavirus pandemic, we saw an increased demand for things like hand sanitizer and Lysol and cleaning agents and rubber gloves and masks. And look how quickly producers of clothing started making masks, producers of alcoholic beverages and other things that use alcohol suddenly were making hand sanitizer with it because alcohol is the main ingredient in hand sanitizer. And so the pursuit of profit very quickly caused the market to change because buyers were telling sellers, this is what we want. And the sellers very quickly moved to produce those goods that suddenly were in demand, whereas before the pandemic began, were not in demand. And so individual property rights are protected. You're able to accumulate as much property as you want, and you're able to accumulate it how you want as well. And nobody else can take it from you unless you voluntarily exchange it. It incentivizes success, and because of this, it often leads to economic growth because both sides win in every voluntary exchange. The big weakness is, yes, it's unequal. The reality is that people have different skills, different abilities, different tolerance for risk, and as a result, a market economy is unequal. And there are some areas where market economies just cannot provide, like public goods. And what we refer to as public goods are things like police and fire protection, the military, that it's very difficult to quantify how much I would spend to have my property protected by police, fire, military, parks, libraries, things like that. It's difficult for me to quantify how much I benefit from those things. And the way I would value them is probably less than what, and the way each individual would value them is probably less than what is truly needed. And so as a result, private protection or a private fire department would probably not be amenable to a lot of people, and therefore the market does not provide those things as well. They do provide them, but not in the large quantities that we desire or demand. So as a result, communities will provide things like public goods outside of the concept of the market economy. Now, that said, in a market economy, those things should be provided as limited as possible and as locally as possible. And so, so it's not necessarily the federal government that's providing public goods except for a military and maybe roads between states. It is, it's the local government, for example, that provides the police protection, the fire protection, the library, the parks, the schools that we look at. So that's the big weakness of a market economy. So capitalism is essentially what a market economy is, and it's based on the idea that all resources are privately owned, that they're owned by individuals or individuals who own businesses, entrepreneurs, and markets allow for decentralized decision-making, that each individual is allowed to make his or her own decisions, and it's the exchange in the market when we buy and sell goods that really governs the economy. And because we're all influenced by our own self-interest, we all work to benefit each other. And so I've already touched on the invisible hand concept. The mixed economy, the reality is most real-world economies are mixed economies in some way. It's just a matter of there's command on one extreme and a market on the other, and it's just how much are you a market economy? The U.S. may be 75 to 80% in the market camp and 20 to 25% in the command camp, whereas Cuba and North Korea are probably more like 95% command. China's probably more like 50 or 60% command. France may be 50 to 60% market. So mixed economies generally combine elements of both. Where there's some private ownership, there's individual property, businesses owned, but the government may own some industries, for example, transportation, education, health. In Europe, obviously, the healthcare industry is owned by the government. A lot of heavy industries are owned by the government. For example, the oil industries are nationalized in some European countries. The steel industry is nationalized. The air industry, where airlines, transportation is nationalized. Here in the U.S., those things are owned by private actors, and therefore governed and regulated by the market. Understand that there's no perfect economic system. There are trade-offs. And so the mixed economy tries to kind of take the best of market economies and the best of command economies and combine them into one. But the reality is that there are trade-offs. Government ownership is going to try to bring about more equality and provide more basic goods in a market economy, but they also provide less economic growth than a market economy. And you can look at the standards of living between, say, the United States, which is mostly a market economy, and Europe, which is a little bit more mixed. It's probably a little more 50-50 in a lot of European countries, and their standard of living is a lot lower than ours. Their homes are smaller. Their transportation choices are more limited in terms of personal transportation. Fewer people own cars. There are fewer options. There are fewer personal possessions. But at the same time, more basic needs are taken care of. So there's the trade-off. If you have more basic needs taken care of, you have less choice. You also have a lower standard of living. If you and you also look at Europe, they have a much higher unemployment rate than we do generally, and they accept the higher unemployment rates. And so therefore their economies are less productive because there are fewer people producing things and fewer people working. So those are trade-offs, and those are some significant trade-offs. So that's just a quick look at the 4 types of economic systems. I know the supplemental videos really go in and explain them as well, but I really wanted to touch on what was in the book. So that is our look at economic systems.